AI it's hot right now. It opens any door if you say the word AI, but I think you're going to see the same thing. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because ultimately, whenever you have something bright and shiny like AI or blockchain out there, it takes away from the focus on the business need. And that's really what we need to be focusing on, the business need. And AI, blockchain, all the other tools that are out there, these are just tools in a toolbox. And that's the way they should be. You use the right tools for the right situation, but you focus on the business need. And that's how you get traction, and make real impact going forward.
Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankur Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Ankur Patel, and today my guest is Christopher McDaniel, who's president at CRC, that's Catastrophe Resiliency Council. Christopher, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So for our audience, do you mind giving us a brief background of CRC as well as what you do today?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Catastrophe Resiliency Council is actually is one of 19 companies that make up a broader industry organization called the Institutes. And there's a lot of different companies that are part of that. Risk-Stream, which I was previously the president of, is the blockchain arm that they have. And the Catastrophe Resiliency Council, which I'm in charge of now, is really focused on solving the resiliency problem in the face of catastrophes and climate change for the industry. A lot of tools and things that need to be created need to be created jointly. They can't be created by one single insurance company or insurance broker or whatever. So it's bringing all the players together to ensure the resiliency of the insurance industry, which in turn will ensure the resiliency for everyone when it comes to catastrophe and climate risk.
What convinced you that blockchain could solve insurance's transactional paralysis problem described in your digital insurance interview that you did?
Yeah, so the challenge from a blockchain standpoint, or from an insurance standpoint, I should say, is that a lot of information is extremely proprietary or is perceived as proprietary, even if there's no real secret sauce in it. So insurance organizations are extremely uncomfortable, if you will, with sharing information with each other. To that end, they really, shy away from it. And unless they have a strong, secure platform such as blockchain to share information, there's very little sharing that happens. So to give you a specific example in that area, one of the platforms that were created in Risk-Stream, it is for if you have 2 automobile, and it can be more than 2, but if you have multiple automobiles in an accident, the insurance companies need to share information. And prior to us putting a solution in place, that process was done literally by people picking up phones and calling each other. So if a call wasn't placed or got delayed or whatever, it could take weeks or months to resolve the claim. With what we put in place, now there's a platform that allows insurers, as soon as any one of the people involved in the accident calls in, that information gets shared with all of the different insurance carriers that are involved. So it's instantaneous sharing. It cuts weeks and weeks and weeks off of the claims process, gets everybody on the same page right from the beginning, and that could only be done through a secure platform like blockchain.
And it feels like today all C-level executives are talking about agentic AI and AI. And the reason why I bring that up is it feels like there was a light bulb moment with ChatGPT and the aftermath that made AI very conversational, very top of mind from senior executives down. What do you think is the case with blockchain? It feels like in some ways we're not at the same level of fervor. What does it take, or what will it take in some ways to get blockchain to be that level of a conversation in a way that AI is today?
Well, and to be honest with you, at one point a number of years ago, when I was over the blockchain initiative, I'm
Mhm.
still on the board, but when I was the president over it, it was at that same level of fervor. All you had
Mhm.
to say with the word blockchain and doors open. But it's that that curve that they have, where you know everything's hot when it first comes out and it goes down. And quite frankly, I think we're going to see the same thing with AI. AI it's hot right now. It opens any door if you say the word AI, but I think you're going to see the same thing. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because ultimately whenever you have something bright and shiny like AI or blockchain out there, it takes away from the focus on the business need. And that's really what we need to be focusing on, the business need. And AI, blockchain, all the other tools that are out there, these are just tools in a toolbox. And that's the way they should be viewed. You use the right tools for the right situation, but you focus on the business need. And that's how you get traction, and make real impact going forward.
I think that's right. I think these buzzy topics like AI and agentic AI and blockchain a couple of years ago, they help open up doors, and then it's the goal is to drive real business outcomes to make it sticky, right? And I think when you're building an AI today, the goal is to use that momentum, that FOMO, that hype to really drive measurable impact so that it's more than a buzzword. It's here to stay. With blockchain, I mean, I think maybe taking a step back, right? A couple of years ago, it was super buzzy. What do you think was the lasting aftermath? Like, what things remained sticky and still have legs? And what things do you think in that regard perhaps maybe didn't stick around? And I'm just curious, sort of that being kind of the segue to the next leg of the conversation I'd like to take it, which is, how do we leverage like the good that blockchain has, right, to go and build in the ways that you imagine in that open door of yours?
Yeah. Well, for us in the insurance industry, it's kind of twofold when it comes to blockchain, as far as the good that stuck around and is still here. And the first thing is that that secure sharing of information between parties that don't necessarily trust each other. That's number one. But number
Yep.
two is the auditability and having a very deep capability to be able to track transactions and know that those transactions are verified, and nothing's flaky's going on. So to give you a perfect example of how we're using the blockchain at the Catastrophe Resiliency Council, one of the big projects that we have right now is to create an open exposure model, meaning to
Mhm.
have a aggregated source of different kind of catastrophe and climate data from multiple different sources. Prior to this project, if you needed catastrophe data, you basically had to go to a single source and you got that data from that source, and you had no way of compare, contrasting, or anything else. And what we are doing is providing the ability to have eventually, and we're not there yet, but to have the ability eventually to have hundreds of different sources of data. And if you have hundreds of different sources of data, you have to be able to capture all that metadata associated with those sources, so that when you go to normalize across that data and try to get one big picture of climate or catastrophe prediction or whatever, that where that data came from, and you can go back and track how that data was put together.
Yep.
That's one of the things that we're using blockchain for, is to have a secure, trusted metadata repository of how all of those fields, all of that data from all of these different sources are calculated, so that you can go back and something looks weird when you pulled all this data together and you're looking at it and you're like, something's strange here. Well, now you have the capability of backing back to the blockchain, and you can say, oh, I see, this particular source was a source that was pulled monthly, and these other sources are all quarterly. Therefore, my monthly source is throwing my data off. So let me take that monthly source out and rerun my model with just the quarterly sources. So that's a real world use of using blockchain in a secure, trusted
Yep.
fashion to be able to look at a very wide universe of data.
Just the immutable logs, the fact that you know exactly all the records are there, right? And so you have that trace, that data trail. I think it's pretty critical, and I think that creates a level of trust and security. I think that is very very important. When you talk to insurance players, how do you get them on board? Because in some ways, it feels like the chicken and the egg problem, which is how do you get this thing going where there's adoption so it draws more people in? So the question becomes like, who becomes the first set of adopters that then encourage the next set to adopt, and then I think that compounds over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you definitely don't do it by talking about blockchain or AI, quite frankly, because these guys have
Sure.
heard it from 50,000 different people. They understand what's
Yeah.
hot and the past hype of blockchain. Like, they've been there, done that. You talk about the business problem. What business
Yeah.
problem are you looking to solve? And once you define that problem, then you can go on to build a technical solution. Once you build a technical solution. So when I talk about our open exposure model, when I show a slide to a prospective participant for us, I show two sides. I show the model on one side, which has, what the business value is of what we're trying to do. And then on the other side, I show the technology stack that has all the pieces and components, because, they want to know that the pieces and components are there, but they really want to know that business model and that business benefit is there. So that's really how we sell it. We sell it with the business benefit and then bring the technology along for the ride, because at some point or another, it's always going to get pushed down to the folks that are the more techie folks, and you need
Sure.
to have both sides of the coin, if you will.
Yeah, I think it becomes less about the technology and what is enabled in terms of business outcomes, and I think that's how you start it. Now, eventually, you do need to get back to the technology to go and implement it and such, but people aren't doing this because the technology is cool or hot or whatever it is, right? It's because it goes and serves business problem that needs to get solved, and this is one of the best ways to solve for it.
Exactly, and that's the thing with, you can, if, like, AI is hot right now, you can get people to join an organization such as ours if we're talking about AI right now, because it's the hot thing and everybody wants to be able to, feel comfortable that they're on board with it. But if you're talking about sustainability over a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and really building real solutions, you got to focus on the business problem.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about risk stream and what that enables, particularly how you get others to participate alongside you.
Yeah. So one of the things we did back in my risk stream days is that we realized pretty early on is that it was at that point in time, it was pretty much the wild wild west. So everybody was doing their own thing, building their own solutions. They were creating silos of data, and they were, building the same solution multiple different times, different flavors, but, still the same solution. So there was just a lot of everything going on back then, kind of the way it is with AI now to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we put together, and this was a real selling point for Riskstream, was we built something called Canopy. And Canopy was one of the first standardized platforms for blockchain. So it had a standardized security layer. It had a standardized, API layer. It had standardized reporting capabilities. It had all of these things where you could take Canopy, and it was agnostic as far as blockchain. You could use, if you wanted to use Ethereum, you could use Ethereum. If you wanted to use something else, you could use something else. It was also cloud agnostic. So we built this Canopy platform, and it enables very rapid development without having to reinvent the wheel. Because in those early days, somebody wanted to create an API layer or API connectivity or reporting or whatever, they were building it from scratch. Well, we basically in Canopy made it where all of those things were standardized so that you could focus on the business need and not building all the other junk that had to go on that was necessary to do it. So Canopy was our early success in selling that, and it actually underpins probably 15 or 20 different solutions right now that have been built on it over time, and it continues to be utilized for new solutions all the time. But that's really that kind of the key thing from a blockchain standpoint. AI, Riskstream is just now getting into AI, and we're using AI in Catastrophe Resiliency Council as well for some really interesting things as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like you have non-standardized ways of doing things. How do you bring that chaos in order and help consolidate, right, the ecosystem so people don't have to rebuild the same things over and over again? they can operate with one another. And I think you're seeing that in AI as well, like these emerging frameworks to go in. And I'll give you some examples: connect context, connect agents to other agents. And I think what I've seen and noticed is that things fall in and out of vogue, right? So you have
Right.
frameworks that rise, then they maybe falter because some other newer framework comes along that solves for it better, right? And I think what ends up happening is that it eventually consolidates around a few set of frameworks that become market standard. And I think the challenge is, how do you get like the big heavyweights to go and champion the same thing, right? So
Yeah.
like, for example, in AI land, it's things like MCP or A2A, right? Like getting multiple players that maybe you wouldn't think would kind of champion the same thing, get around to kind of an industry standard. How do you do the same thing in blockchain world, which is getting critical mass and standardization around, things like risk stream is introduced?
It's all about the industry contacts and the kind of people that we have as memberships of these organizations. Risk Stream and the Catastrophe Resiliency Council and all of the different organizations under the institutes are all not for profits. One of the things that the industry has been burned on multiple different times is somebody comes and says, "I have this great solution," and everybody jumps on board, and all of us, yeah, and it's a for-profit solution, and all of a sudden, it started out at X price, and then it's 100 times X down the road, and they're really gun shy about that. So it's not that we can't use for-profit solutions. For-profit solutions are necessary, but the industry as a whole really likes it when you have a not-for-profit that's guiding the way, because they know that they don't have a dog in the fight, if you will, and are keeping things fair and and equitable for everybody. So that's one of having a not-for-profit leader is a very important thing, I think. And that's whether that's risk blockchain or AI or some future technology. I think the same thing applies. But I also think there's a maturity scale to what we're talking about.
Mhm.
In the early days on any new technology, AI is where it is now. Let's take another one that's even more early in the process, quantum computing.
Yeah.
That's another one that's coming, but is still too early for most folks to really get deep on. They can get into AI now. Quantum
Yep.
computing, that's not something they can do yet, but everybody knows it's coming. All of these new technologies and things, when they come out, I think have a life cycle. And the early life cycle is always going to be the Wild West. Everybody's doing everything. Everybody's trying all these kind of things. And then as time goes by, you start getting the stabilization. You start getting the frameworks and the platforms and the reusability and all these other kind of things that are important. And the end of the line, not the end of the line, but the standardization in the long term is when it becomes one more thing in the toolbox. So you have a whole toolbox of things to build business solutions. In the early days, there's so much hype and everything, it's really hard to get there. I think you have to go through that life cycle, with any new technology that comes out.
How do you handle for this cooperation versus competition dynamic, which is, insurers obviously want to compete on products, they want to compete on customer service and experiences, but in some ways you're pushing them to collaborate and standardize on the infrastructure. Now, how do you get that fine balance between the two?
Yeah, it really comes down to, and whether it's an insurance carrier, insurance broker, a reinsurer, you know, and all the individual players in those three spaces, they all to a certain degree believe that what they're doing is it's the secret sauce that makes them
Hmm.
different, that sets them apart from everybody else. And in a lot of cases, it does. But also in a lot of cases, there's common stuff that they just don't know that their competition is doing the exact same thing in the exact same way. So part of that process of starting to expose some of those things in a very careful way is to help educate the players on what really is secret sauce versus what is we're all doing the same thing just under a different name kind of thing. And once you can start getting an understanding between players, and it's not something that happens overnight, it's something that you have to build over time, because
Hmm.
everybody shows a little bit more inside the kimono as you go. But ultimately, you get to a place where everybody can say, like for example, with our risk stream of sharing the data back and forth on the auto accident solution that we have, they're all using the same data. There's no secret sauce to having that information or having that information earlier. In fact, if you have it before your competition has it and you're trying to settle a claim, it doesn't help you any. All it does is slow down the claim process. So getting to that point is not a easy place to get to, and you have to take them a little bit at a time. But just the mere fact that these organizations are willing to become a part of one of our not-for-profit organizations and to have conversations, careful conversations, but conversations all the same to ultimately get there is important. And it does just takes time to get everybody comfortable.
I think one of the big questions or things that are really always really important is how do you get that sense of urgency, right, from insurers so they move ahead with initiatives like this? Because you could argue on paper all day that this is the right move and it makes a lot of rational sense, but a lot of decision making is driven by emotions, right? Do I feel that I'm missing out if I don't do this? What's a hair on fire type of problem? So how do you convince carriers that are maybe inherently slower moving, they're more risk averse, to really move on something like this sooner rather than later?
Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, anytime you can have it be a thou shalt from the regulatory agencies, that motivates them. They jump on board with that real quick. Second, second to a mandate from the regulatory agencies, I think when you can show real business value and you can say, one of the things that we do a lot is, we do return on investment models for our stuff. And we can say, okay, this is costing you $100 million now. If you implement the solution, it's going to, save you 30 million off of that 100 million. I'm just making those numbers up, of course, but being able to show a real ROI is important. And then the other thing is the fear of missing out, just the FOMO, like you're talking about. If you look at the top 10 of the insurance entities in the U.S., if you get any 3 or 4 of those organizations that have jumped on the bandwagon, everybody else jumps on the bandwagon. So a lot of times it's about getting particular organizations involved, having those relationships with them to be able to connect the dots to get them to be involved. That's a big part of it because, like I said, it doesn't take a huge tipping point once you get a certain number before everybody jumps on board.
And then on the regulators piece, I think that's a very interesting thread because if you are close to the regulators, can bring some of the awareness around regulatory changes that are coming down the pipe to carriers and let that be a wedge in, right? Which is like, this is where the market's headed. These are the changes that are coming down the pipe. We know the regulators. We've spoken with them. That is really enabling, right? They're much more willing to listen because, regulatory expense and compliance is super critical, right? So how have you built those relationships, leverage those learnings to then create more momentum with the conversations you have with the insurers themselves?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do is we actually give the regulators a seat at the table. So all regulation in the insurance market in the U.S. is done at the state level, but so you'd have to get every single state commission or whatever. But you have the NAIC that kind of sits on top of that, and the NAIC is an actual member of the Catastrophe Resiliency Council, and they have a seat at the table. And one of the things that, not only is it new regulations that are coming down the pipe that can drive the popularity of an initiative, but also existing regulations that are burdensome to the carriers. They're always looking for a way because they don't, rightly or wrongly, they don't perceive those existing regulations that require them to jump through hoops of fire as something that's adding value. You can argue that all day long, whether it really does add value or not, but one of the things that the regulators do is they do something called data calls. And that is jump through hoops of fire, argue about what can be included and not included for 6 months to a year with every single different carrier. And it is just a big mess every time they do a data call. Valuable data that's gathered. But, in the case of what we're doing, is that kind of open exposure data that we're talking about. One of the things that our open exposure model is going to allow the regulators to do in a controlled environment, you don't give just, carte blanche for everything. But one of the things it's going to do for the regulators, once we have all the data for everybody in there. They can run their own data calls instead of asking the insurance company to do this, that, and jump through hoops of fire. They can just push a button, do whatever they need to do to gather data. So it's better for the regulators because they get better, more granular data that's, instead of some big mass request. But it also takes a huge burden off of the insurance companies to be able to have that data accessible in a controlled way.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think that that's a great way to go and build trust and bring new insights and such to the table, right? I think with regulators, particularly around, there's blockchain, there's AI, how much of it is you, your team, people shaping what the regulators use versus the regulators come in and they kind of know the lay of the land. They're looking for industry experts and such to kind of go in, be a sounding board to things that are coming down the pipe. So in other ways, how much are you coaching and shaping versus how much are they leading as part of those conversations?
Well, I think if you look at the NAIC, they're pretty sophisticated. They have their own group that's focused on catastrophe and climate. So they as a group, have a little bit more luxury as far as being able to do that kind of stuff. If you look at the individual states, most of the time those poor people are doing everything on a shoestring, and they're barely keeping the lights on for what they have to do in their state. So it's a much bigger challenge on a state by state level on what can be done. So if you're looking for something, that the NAIC is pretty straightforward on how to make them happy. If you're looking for I'm just picking a state. If you look for the state of Michigan, who's running on a shoestring and they really need this data to be able to, help guide, their legislature and everything else, it's much, much harder for them in, the old environment to do that. With something like the open exposure model, they can create that they would have the access to the data to be able to go in and gather that data that they need, again, in a controlled environment, but be able to gather that data to be able to do what they need for their state. And that is almost impossible now in the individual states just because they're so budget constrained.
If RiskStream succeeds, what traditional insurance roles will be obsolete by 2030?
Well, I don't think that Restream is actually trying to eliminate any particular solution. They're really trying to forge new pathways where there weren't ones before. So like I said, for example, before with our RapidX is the name of the solution, with the auto solution. With the RapidX solution, it was, pre that solution, everybody's having to make phone calls to each other, and it's all, so maybe there's some administrative staff that would get eliminated because of that, of being able to do that in an automated fashion. But it's not a sea change where there's entire areas that are going to change. It's more about, doing things better and automating solutions and making people's jobs easier rather than, than a lot of red tape and back and forth and things like that. Now, it's a little bit different with the Catastrophe Resiliency Council because, Riskstream is very operational. Maybe that's a good way of putting it. They're very operational as far as the solutions that they build. But the Catastrophe Resiliency Council, on the other hand, is not so much building operational solutions as they are looking forward solutions. So it's how can we gather all of this data that's never been gathered together before to be able to provide it to these insurance entities and regulators and whatnot, so that they can make decisions with the right data. Before, if they had one source of data, it was very hard for them to make a decision. So just to give you an example, with our open exposure model, you would have what I call the classic catastrophe cat data. So things like your age of roof, type of roof, things like that for a home. And generally that and having some weather information to run on top of it is all that anybody had in the past. Well, if you've got a hurricane that's about to hit New Orleans, for example, you want to know the age of roof and type of roof and all that kind of stuff. But you also want to know, there's a lot of historical homes in New Orleans. Wouldn't you want to know what those historical homes are and what the cost of those? Wouldn't you want to know the infrastructure? You want to know what those levees are that might break and what the age of those levees are, when they were last maintained. Economic data, what is going to be impacted if that hurricane hits? What is the actual economic impact to the community? All of those things, and there's just all of these sources of data. There's tons of data that's out there, but nobody is really aggregating all this data together. And that's what our open exposure model does. It brings in all those sources of data. And then the interesting thing that we do on top of that with AI is we're building out the solutions so that we can use AI to normalize across all that data. If you've got 5 sources of data like that, like some of the ones I just named, okay, you can probably still do it the old way. But if you've got 200 sources of data and you've got to normalize across 200 different data sources, AI is the only way that you can do that, to pull out the patterns and the things that are important and what really needs to be surfaced across that very large sea of data.
Yep. No, I think that makes a lot of sense, Christopher. Maybe last question here, which I think is really critical. Obviously you're working with executives on very large scale projects, sometimes ones that span multiple years, right? So how do you keep them focused, bought in, where that momentum is still as alive and apparent, in year 3 or year 4 as it is in the first 3 months, right? That's really critical for something as audacious and be challenging in the ways that you introduce some of this technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And number one, you don't try to boil the ocean all at once. I mean, you might get a lot of hype out of saying we've got this
Yeah.
huge project and it's going to do everything in the first year, and that always fails. And multiple year projects that go on trying to solve the same solution year over year, those ultimately fail. What you've got to be able to do is you've got to be able to define the vision, project the vision, and then define small steps, small wins all along the way. It doesn't matter if it takes you 20 steps to get to the final solution. If you can show wins and provide ROI each step of the way for those 20 steps, you'll keep people engaged. If if it's pie in the sky and we may get here in 3 years or whatever, it's really hard to keep people on board, because all these folks that are involved in these projects that we have, they have day jobs. So they're bringing their valuable time to the table, and they want to see real results in order to stay engaged.
I love that. It's a mapping for a longer journey, showing progress and milestones along the way, but really acknowledging up front that this is a complex, challenging endeavor, right? You need to know that going in. It's much more realistic. It's much more grounded. And I think that advice applies to all sorts of new technology that needs to get adopted, blockchain,
Absolutely.
AI, and in the future, quantum. So, Christopher, really appreciate all your thoughts and wisdom around some of this, and very excited to be following the things that you're doing, because I think the work that we're doing here with agentic AI and automation and such is another big thread that's happening right now. I think the work you're doing is yet another big thread that's happening. So it's fascinating to see a lot of innovation come down the pipe for a space like insurance, and very excited that you're part of this bigger, broader journey just as we are.
Absolutely.